Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to just start by saying that I'm honored to be here. This is a tricky talk to give. It invites a speaker into an intimate part of your lives, and I'm honored to be welcomed into that space and to acknowledge that all of you are here and putting in work to be better either spouses or future spouses or better partners to one another. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and I'm honored to be a part of that. So one of the things that I think is important, and one of the reasons this is a hard talk that people aren't sure how to give sometimes, is because if this group is at all statistically ordinary, there are people in this room who have used, are using, or plan to use artificial contraceptives. And when you do marriage prep in the Catholic Church, someone's got to show up and tell you why the Catholic Church says that's a bad idea. So that's an awkward thing for a speaker to find themselves in. And I want to acknowledge right off the hop that I know the situation I'm walking into. I know that if we reflect the broader culture at all, I'm talking to a group of people who are not coming to this from a neutral point of view. It's already impacting your decisions and your life. And I want you to know that I don't come in here expecting, it would be great if it happened, but I don't come in here expecting that everyone leaves today, goes home and chucks the contraceptives in the garbage and said, that speaker was the best speaker I've ever heard. We are done with these contraceptives. Life begins again today, right? If that happens, send me a letter, because I'd love to know about that. But I'm not planning this talk so that if you don't agree with me by the end of it, it was a waste of your time. I'm planning this talk knowing that it's very unlikely that I'm going to convince everyone in this room, but that there are still things that we can learn and think about that will make us better spouses, even better parents. Because when we think about family planning, it's not simply a question of what method do we use that is most effective for avoiding babies. But it comes down to questions of how does our physical intimacy relate to the rest of our relationship, and what is our attitude towards children, and how do we approach these questions? And whether or not you end up agreeing with me or with the church completely, there are still things worth considering and worth learning about and integrating in your relationship about physical intimacy and about children. And so I want to give you permission to take what is helpful for you, to listen for things. Maybe I disagree with that, maybe I disagree with this, maybe I have questions about that, but there's still something here for me, whether or not I'm willing to go all the way with this speaker in the next hour and a half, right? So I want to grant you that permission right from the start. All right. A first simple question. How many of us knew with some certainty before we got here today that the Catholic Church thinks artificial contraception is a bad idea? Most of us have heard that. Okay, that's good. Just in case this is brand new for anyone, I don't want to be, what? Okay, that's good. Second question. How many of you would say that even though you know that the Catholic Church thinks artificial contraception is a bad idea, that you've heard a clear and compelling argument or talk about this that would give you the confidence to go forth and explain to somebody else why the Catholic Church thinks that way? 5 or 6, 7? All right, so that's not bad. That's roughly what I would expect, right? So a significant minority would say they've heard something compelling on this, which means that a majority feel they haven't heard something compelling on this. This doesn't surprise me at all, because as Catholics, we don't talk about this a lot. It's very rare that it would show up in a homily, for instance. we may or may not have heard about it in our Catholic schools. And if we heard about it in our Catholic schools, we may have heard about it from someone who understood it and believed it and could present it in a compelling and integral way. Or we may have heard it from someone who it was in the curriculum and they were told they had to do it, but they really knew nothing about it. They had no personal commitment to this idea, but they were checking a box, right? And if we heard it in that context, it was probably not particularly helpful for us, right? What I want to suggest to you, and what frames my approach today is, it's not fair to you to be getting married in a church that believes this thing, which almost nobody else believes, right? Like maybe the Amish, right? Very few groups in our culture think artificial contraception is a bad idea. You're going to be getting married or have gotten married in a church that believes this, and for most of us, we've never heard a good explanation. I don't think that's fair to you. I don't think it's fair to sign up for something and not know what the deal is, right? And I think there's at least a couple ways that this can have a really sort of negative impact for people. If you are doing something that the church you belong to and the church you get married in thinks is wrong, but you've never had a clear explanation about that, you might have some kind of vague sense of shame or guilt about what you're doing, but never have the tools to think about why I should or should not be doing it. I do it because everyone does it. I do it because it's common sense. I do it because we need to. What are you, crazy? What is the alternative? Have 20 kids? Come on, right? If we haven't thought about alternatives, but we have this vague sense we're not supposed to be doing it, it puts this impediment in our relationship with the church, because now all of a sudden it's judging us about something, and we've never really had time to think about or engage with this question, right? That's one way it can go, is a kind of vague shame or guilt. Another way it can go is a sense of anger or resentment. Like, who do these people think they are? They don't know anything about my life. They don't know anything about what I need or what's healthy for us. They should keep their noses out of our business. They have no business in our bedroom. Why do they think they can have anything to say about this? Whether you go the shame and guilt direction or the anger and resentment direction, you have been put in that position unfairly by belonging to a church or getting married in a church and not getting a clear picture of the story. So my goal today, I may not do it perfectly, and I'm going to strive my best. My goal today is that when you leave here, the next time someone asks, have you heard a clear presentation on this, you can put up your hand. You may or may not agree with me at the end, but at least you know what you've signed up for, right? And you have the opportunity to engage with it as a free person. If you don't have the information, you are less free. Someone showing up and giving you information isn't imposing anything on you. They are giving you an opportunity to make a decision with more information, and that makes you more free. So that's my goal for you today, is to give you a better opportunity to make a decision because you have more information. All right. Couple of things I'm not going to talk about today. I'm not giving a biology lesson, so we won't have any sort of anatomy charts over here. We're not going to talk about cervical mucus. That gets a little awkward, right? Not that you shouldn't ever talk about it. If you want to learn how this works, there's lots of context for that, but I don't think that's the most helpful thing for us at this stage. The other thing I'm not going to be doing today, I'm not going to do a bunch of finer points of moral philosophy. Is this a venial sin? Is this a mortal sin? Why is it wrong? When, if ever, might it be right? What about these extreme cases, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not doing that. We can ask questions about that if those are your questions. They're important, but I don't think they're the most important starting point for us. I think the most important starting point in a group like this is, let's zoom out from the question of what kind of birth control do we use or not use, and think about bigger questions like, what is the role of physical intimacy in our relationship, and how does that relate to the rest of what we're doing as a couple? And what do we think about children? Not just how many do we think we're going to have and what should we name them and do we want a boy or a girl, but more generally, what is our attitude towards children? So the first talk is going to focus on those two questions, our physical intimacy in our relationship and our attitude towards children. And those, I hope, will give you useful things to think about that will make you better partners, better spouses, better parents, no matter what you decide about church teaching at the end of this day. And in the second talk, we're going to look more specifically at how natural family planning works, not in terms of biology, but how does it work in terms of a relationship? What does it look like to concretely practice this, and how does that relate to the rest of our intimacy, and how does that relate to our decisions about children, right? So that's the basic picture. All right, so to start with, how does our physical intimacy relate to the rest of our lives and our relationships? It's worth considering. I think often when we use the word intimacy, our first, not our only, but very often our first connection is with physical. When we say we're going to talk about intimacy, we think we're talking about physical intimacy. But of course we know that there's actually lots of other areas of intimacy in our lives. We can be emotionally intimate. We can be socially intimate. We can be intellectually or spiritually intimate. Growing in intimacy with one another is not simply a progress from sort of holding hands to having sex in the physical intimacy realm, but it's growing together in all these other areas, growing together emotionally, so that we feel safe around the other person and we can share our fears or our hopes, growing socially together, right? When you get engaged, as so many people in this room have, you're in a new social situation vis-a-vis one another's families, vis-a-vis each other's friends, right? Lots of us are now going to be friends with people that we wouldn't have been friends with if our spouse or future spouse wasn't friends with that person, right? Trust me, after 13 years, you see these things growing. Someone who you might not have wanted to spend a lot of time with actually becomes a pretty good pal, right? Your social intimacy is shaped by one another. Intellectual intimacy, can you share ideas? Does the other person care what you think about this or that question? When you're excited by something, are they someone who's going to listen to you, right? Spiritual intimacy, do we pray together? Do we pray for one another? Are we aware of the other person's needs at a spiritual level so that we can engage them? I'll tell you what, just speaking as a guy, I've never encountered a situation where a woman was offended because the guy said, you know, I was praying for that situation, that exam you've got coming up, or that, you know, that problem going on with your parents or whatever. People feel really cared for and understood when you can demonstrate that spiritual intimacy by saying, I'm keeping this situation or this intention of yours in prayer, right? So all of these different areas of intimacy relate to each other and build upon one another. Now, one of the things that can happen is that these areas of intimacy can get out of whack. You can be too intimate in one area, and you know it's too intimate because it's way ahead of the other areas, right? Has anyone ever gone on a date with an oversharer? At least a couple of you have gone on a date with an oversharer, right? You don't know this person super well, right? They're not a longtime friend. Maybe someone, you know, set you two up, or you met briefly and they were attractive enough you thought it was worth a shot. And like half an hour in, you're like, slow down. Like, I am not your therapist. I am not your mom. Right? We all know that this is awkward. Why do we know it's awkward? Because the emotional or the social intimacy has just been ramped up, and it's not related to the rest of what's going on. You haven't put in the time, you haven't built up the commitment with this person to be sharing certain kinds of things, and it feels awkward, right? The most common intimacy to get out of whack, especially early in a relationship, is physical intimacy. It is really easy to ramp up physical intimacy in a way that disconnects it from the level of intimacy that we've reached in social or emotional or spiritual or intellectual realms, right? Most of us have seen this happen. We recognize it really well when it happens to our friends. We recognize it less well when it happens to us, right? And we know this because when we watch our friends who are in a relationship that has gotten too physically intimate too fast, we can see all the warning signals. This guy is not a good guy, or this girl is not a good girl. But physical intimacy gives us the impression that all the other intimacies are trucking along because we get such a physical rush from it. You get a lot of serotonin from making out, or more than making out, right? And it gives you the idea that the emotional intimacy and the social intimacy and everything is trucking along great. How many people have seen someone get trapped in a bad relationship that they can't see that it's bad, and a pretty good explanation for that would be the physical intimacy is ramped up so high that their radar is thrown off and they can't tell that the rest of this relationship isn't working very well. Anyone seen a relationship like that, right? Yeah, virtually all of us. Some of us have been in them ourselves, right? Physical intimacy can throw off our radar for figuring out what's going on in the rest of a relationship. Physical intimacy is a terrible lead in terms of intimacy. It's a great follower. Put in the time and investment on emotional intimacy. Put it in on social intimacy, right? Ask people how they feel. Talk about what you hope for or what you're afraid of. Spend time with each other's family or each other's friends. Engage with the ideas of the person, right? If they're really into opera and you're not, ask them about it. If you're really into sports and they're not, right? Engage with the ideas that keep the other person excited, right? And as I mentioned before, praying for one another, right? Praying with one another, going to Mass together. Put in the time and the effort on those things, and the physical intimacy that follows from those will be so much more rewarding and so much less fraught with anxiety or confusion about what exactly does this mean in the relationship. Most of us will have been in a situation where something physically happened between us and another person, maybe the person we're here with today, maybe a person in a previous relationship, and either as it was happening or the next day or over the next week, we thought, what did that mean? What does it mean that we did that thing together? We didn't think about that in terms of the rest of our relationship, but now I don't understand it, right? Sometimes this is when the phone call comes, we need to talk. And you're like, oh no, something's wrong here. But people start to feel off because they know that something's not right. This is a very common experience when we lead with the physical. What we want to learn how to do, and which will make us better lovers and give us a better sex life in the long term, is to integrate our physical intimacy with the rest of our relationship. We need to learn how to do that while we're dating and as we're engaged and as we're growing in physical intimacy towards marriage and sex. But even once you're in a relationship where you're having sex, whether you're married or not, right? If this group is not completely statistically abnormal, there are people who have had, are having, and plan to have sex. If you're in that situation, you still need to work on what is the relationship between our physical intimacy and the rest of what is going on in our relationship together. As a married guy, right? Here's a married guy situation. You've got half an hour to kill. You're looking good, right? Everything. Why don't we take advantage of this time, right? And she's not interested. And you think, is it my shirt? Do I need to have a shower? Are we busy with something? And she's actually thinking about that thing you said yesterday, which you have completely forgotten. You have no idea what she's talking about, right? But you got half an hour, What do we, let's not waste time talking about that when we could be doing this, right? Really easy mistake to make. What are we doing there, guys? We're forgetting that physical intimacy needs to be related to our emotional intimacy or our social intimacy or something else in our relationship that's off. This applies, and I speak from a guy's perspective, but of course it applies in reverse as well. A person you're going to have sex with needs to feel cared for by you and understood in other areas of their life. If they're having trouble at work, if they're having trouble with their family, if they're having trouble with school, if something's wrong with one of their friends, if there's a health crisis, whatever else is going on in life needs your care and attention. And when a person feels, and this is particular for women, but not exclusively for women, when a person feels cared for and attended to and understood in those other areas, they are really into you, right? If you're wondering why she's not that into you, it's probably because she's not feeling cared for and attended to and understood in other areas. Take the time to ask the question, put in the work on those other things, physical intimacy will follow. We get the impression from our culture, think of right? Think of Cosmo magazine or think of porn, right? What do Cosmo magazine and porn tell us are important for good sex? Technique and the right body type, right? Do you know what all the studies show? Those are virtually irrelevant to good sex. I mean, you can get better at technique with some practice, but looking like or doing things that are described in Cosmo or shown in a porn flick does not actually make you better lovers and does not bring you closer together and does not make you feel good about your sex life. In fact, very often trying to mimic or copy these things leaves us feeling empty and confused. Why didn't it work? How come this isn't making me a better lover? How come we don't feel more intimate and close together? How come we don't want to just do it 3-4 times a day because this is awesome? Because we're not putting in the work in the other areas. When it comes to thinking about our sexual needs with one another, we can then get tricked as well into thinking we're just talking about technique or body type, right? What do we need from one another? Do we need to look more attractive? Do we need to engage in this particular action or this particular position? Is that really what sexual needs are? It's not what sexual needs are. At our deepest root, what we want from another person in bed is to feel understood and cared for. That may take the form of trying something that the other person is interested in trying in terms of technique or position, but the point isn't the technique or the position. The point is, do you listen to and understand why another person feels and needs something? Sex is a place where we don't have to be, where we really should be open and free with one another. It can be a very healing experience to be with someone when you live in a culture that says, you probably won't have good sex because you don't have a body that would put you on the cover of this magazine. You probably won't have good sex because your anatomy doesn't look like the porn star's anatomy. You probably won't have good sex because you're getting older, or you're gaining weight, or you have a health problem, etc., etc., etc. And when we can be with one another and we can counteract the narratives that we hear from the culture that lead to body image problems and performance anxiety problems and all kinds of other things, and say this isn't about any of that. This is about being with one another, enjoying one another, and caring for one another. You can have a great sex life that looks nothing like what's described in Cosmo or in a porn flick, right? And all this isn't just Catholic teaching. All the studies from the sexologists say the same thing, right? That the false images we get from the media do not help us have healthy attitudes and healthy sexuality. But what's going on when we're having these conversations and when we're taking care of one another in this way? We're engaging in sex like it's not just a physical thing. We're engaging in sex as if it has emotional layers, as if it has even social layers, because it shapes what happens in your bedroom. Shapes, and the first recipients of this, of course, are your children. It shapes the way you live in community, right? If we contextualize sex within our whole relationship, we're much happier and we're much better at being lovers for one another, which really means we have a way of taking care of this other person who has trusted their lives to us. I want to tell you a little story. So one of the things that couples need to talk about, on top of their fantasies and their expectations and their fears, is frequency. How often should this happen in our life at this time? My wife and I were married for about 11 years before she read a book that led her to turn to me in bed one night and say, how often, to be like perfectly happy, like the ideal amount, what would that be for you? Now, I'm not going to tell you the answer. Guys, you already know the answer, right? Girls, if you don't know the answer, just ask. It's pretty simple, actually. Now, I'll tell you what, we got 6 kids. When she first asked me the questions, we had twins that were less than a year old. I'll tell you, we didn't make the goal, right? But the thing is, having the conversation actually made our sex life better, even if it didn't increase the amount at all. Because now someone was attending to the other person and showing care for them. What could we do for you in this area of our life so that you feel more cared for? If you can frame any of your questions around expectations or fears or fantasies or whatever as, how can I care for this other person who's entrusted their life to me? You've got really good odds of a good sex life, right? All right. In the second talk, we're going to look in some detail at how the practice of natural family planning comes into play with these conversations and with our attitudes towards physical intimacy, and how those things relate to the rest of what we're doing in our marriages. Because just as a kind of a spoiler, once you involve children, they connect to everything else. There is nothing you do in your relationship that isn't related to what you're doing as parents, or even as potential parents, right? Okay, second half of this talk, we talked about physical intimacy and its role in a relationship. Now we want to think about children and our attitude towards children. If we're engaged to be married in the Catholic Church, we are planning to make a promise in front of God and in front of the community. And the promise says, do you promise to receive children lovingly from God? And you will say, I do. If you don't, you actually can't get married in a Catholic church. You can't be like, sorry, Father, not that one. Next question, please. No. You're going to be asked, will you receive children lovingly from God? And you will say, I do. Have we thought about what that phrase means for us in our relationship? What does it mean when we say, I will receive children lovingly from God? Does it mean, yeah, we'd probably have kids at some point, I guess, if it works out? Maybe. I'm kind of busy for the next 10 years, but we'll see. Does it mean, yes, his name will be William and her name will be Mary, and then, snip, snip, right? Have we paid attention to the language? I think the key word here is receive. Because the language receive tells us that children are a gift. The basic attitude of the church towards children is that they are not a product. You don't make them. They're not some consumer entity, right? But they're a gift that you receive. They come naturally out of what follows from marriage. There's not a very specific time where you do something that you would never do otherwise. Just go into the store and punch in the code and order the model that you want, and right? That's not how they work. But sometimes in our culture, we can kind of drift towards thinking of children as products or as commodities. But if they're a gift, that turns things upside down, because I think what our culture gives the impression of sometimes is that you actually need a pretty good reason to have kids. I know this, having 6 kids, people say things to you in the grocery store, or, well, almost anywhere. Actually, people will say things to you if you have 6 kids. And one of the things people said to us that was really interesting, we had 2 little boys first, and then we had a bit of a space, and then we were pregnant with a third. So what happens if you go to the park to go play with 2 little boys, and mama's obviously pregnant? What do people say? Trying for a girl? Actually, we were trying for a baby, right? If it's a truck, that's going to be awkward, right? We had a little girl. We're delighted it was a girl, and there's nothing wrong with like even hoping for a girl if you've got a bunch of boys or vice versa. There's nothing wrong with that. But is that the only reason you should have a baby if you've got 2 boys? Is because you haven't completed the set yet, right? It gets really weird. Now, here's what happens next. We got 2 boys, we got a girl, we go to the park, mama's pregnant. People are saying, what are you doing? You've already got the whole set, right? But Daisy isn't Dorothy. We did it. We had another girl. So we had 2 boys and 2 girls. Then good luck showing up pregnant at Home Depot. But anyways. Then we got twins. Oh my goodness. More on that later. But this presumption you kind of need a license or a good reason to be having children, right, comes out in some of the language that we use. And just a little aside, one of the concerns that some people have is around overpopulation, right? There's just too many people on the planet. We won't go into a whole lot of detail here, except to say most of us will have been given the impression at some point in our education that the world's population is something like a runaway train, right? There was a chart on the wall in my grade 9 social studies class that showed this sort of exponential growth of the world's population with no end in sight. If you didn't know this, demographers have known for some time, and a book just came out February 2019 called Empty Planet, because we actually know, and there's no way of stopping this at this point, that within our lifetime, the global population is going to peak and start to decline. And this shouldn't actually surprise us, because we live in a country that only increases its population by immigration, right? Without immigration, we have already reached the point where we've peaked and we are in decline. And there's countries all over the world that are frantically trying to increase their birth rate. Japan is in a terrible situation with its birth rate, and it's in decline. And we don't know what happens when a population starts to decline. Every example we have in history of a subpopulation that starts to decline is that it bottoms out. That's just the end. We don't know what happens globally when that starts to happen. But there are serious economic, environmental, social consequences. We see it just with our pension plan, right? The pension, you have to push retirement later and later because there's fewer young people working to support the retirees, right? So things like Social Security and Medicare and whatever else get very difficult with a declining population, right? So, if you're interested to study more about population, by all means do, but don't buy the narrative that world population is a runaway train. It's not. The train is slowing down, and it is set to start going in reverse in our lifetime. So the culture has this attitude. Sometimes overpopulation is part of the attitude. Sometimes consumerism is part of the attitude, children as commodities. That you need a good reason to have children. The church has a precisely inverse of this attitude. The church's attitude is children are natural, they are healthy, they are good, they are what follow from marriage if everything is going the way it should be going. If people are healthy, if the social pressures are, if people don't have to be apart for work, or whatever, if everything is good and healthy and going the way it should, children just naturally follow. You don't even actually say, tonight we're trying to have a baby, unless you've been struggling to have a baby. It just happens in life. That's the church's attitude. But you might have a good reason not to. And all of us can think of good reasons not to. If you're paying attention to the world at all, there would be times in people's lives where there's good reasons not to have children. People's health is not always great. People's finances are not always great. People's other obligations do not always admit for the kinds of freedom that you would need for children, right? There's all kinds of reasons why it might make sense to not have a child right now. Not being married would be one of them, right? There's all kinds of reasons to not have a child right now, or even for some time into the future, because we can't predict what's going to happen with this health issue, or this other child we have who has a lot of needs, or this job situation that is unstable, or the fact that we live in 2 different cities right now, or right? Life happens, and there are all kinds of good reasons why you might not want a child right now. But notice that it's the inverse of the world's attitude, right? The world's attitude is you need a good reason to have kids. The church's attitude is you need a good reason not to. It's really that simple. And so we can ask ourselves, what is our basic attitude? Have we thought of it in terms of, yeah, we need a really good reason. All the circumstances have to be perfect. We need to have the house and the 2-car garage, and we need to have traveled, and we both need good jobs, and everything has to be lined up just perfect, and then we'll have 2, and then we're done? Or is it children are basically good? If we're getting married, we expect children. Life is going to happen at some point, and probably there will be times when it's not a good idea to have children. But in general, children are a good thing, and that's what we're expecting in marriage, right? Which way have we approached it? My guess is, for most of us, we've found parts of the world's attitude in ourselves, whether we wanted to find them there or not, because it's just the water we're swimming in, right? We're going to pick it up. All right. Couple more things about children. The church doesn't say, by the way, that because children are good and people should have them, that you need to have lots of them to be a good Catholic, right? There's no magic number. It's great to have lots of kids. I know lots of people with lots of kids. None of them say, I didn't want half of them, or could you please take them away? Well, jokingly, they'll say you can have them for a while, but right? But there's no magic number that the church says you need to have in order to be a good Catholic. And more to it, the church does not give you a list of reasons that are good enough. They don't say, if you make this much money, you should be having more kids, but when you drop below this income line, then it's okay for you to, dial it back. It doesn't say that this health condition is serious enough, but this one isn't. It doesn't sit back and make judgments on us. It says to us in our consciences, if you're being honest with yourselves about what's a serious reason or not, and it leaves it to us. That doesn't mean it might not be helpful to talk to a friend or another couple that's in the same situation, or a priest, or some presenter at marriage prep who maybe said something that made you think he or she had some ideas on the topic. You can consult with other people, but it's your decision in conscience. You know what's going on in your life, and the church doesn't presume about that, right? So that's important to know. But the last thing on that is, if you open yourself to this attitude of children as a gift, what you find is a capacity for joy in receiving that gift. Doesn't mean it's easy, right? I'll tell you, twins are hard, like really hard. And people who have kids with special needs, and there's all kinds of ways in which children can be very difficult. But when they are received as a gift, the joy and the capacity for joy that brings into your family, that even goes beyond you and your spouse, but goes into the other children. It's a beautiful thing to see. Some of us will know of situations where there were people who thought they were done having children. And something happened, life happens, and it turns out they weren't done having children. There's a pretty good chance that there are people in this room who are only in this room because someone thought they were done having children and then they weren't. right? Third children, fourth children, fifth children, sixth children, anyone, right? Surprises, that's the good word for it. We'll talk about the bad word for it in the second talk, right? And we're delighted. We're so glad you're here. Thank you for coming, right? We'll talk in the next talk about accidents. Never call a child an accident. You can't make a child by accident. You actually can't do it. I mean, I could draw you a picture of what happened. It wasn't an accident, right? All right. A comment about our twins to finish this first talk. You know, sometimes people will see a family like ours with 3 or 4 or 6. We skipped 5. 6 kids, and they say, how do you do it? Now, before we had twins, our answer was, well, they just come one at a time, right? you always, the first child you have is really, really hard. And then it gets easier. And then the second child you have is like really, really hard. And then it gets easier. And then the third child you have is like really, really hard. And then it gets easier, right? So when we had 3 children, we sent the brothers to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a couple weeks while we were moving, and it was just the 2 of us and little Daisy. And was that ever easy? It was just 2 of us and 1 baby. Now, the first time we did that was really hard, right? So you do it one at a time, and you learn how to handle it. Now, God has a sense of humor. If your answer to people is, well, they only come one at a time, he's going to give you twins. So the twins show up, right? And here's the thing about natural family planning, and it's in this way, it's like any other way you might have of trying to avoid pregnancy, right? And it's not only that. I hope that much is clear, and we'll talk more about it. But if we're comparing it to other ways of avoiding pregnancy, the percentages are pretty comparable, right? For perfect use, you're going to have high 90s% effectiveness, right? But for actual use, you're going to have significantly lower, 70s, small 80s, whatever, right? Every form of family planning will have a perfect use statistic and an actual use statistic because people don't use things perfectly. But it's basically a wash. If you're just comparing it on those levels, it's roughly as effective as anything else. But what twins taught us, which I think is a really important lesson, is even when you think you're in control of when the children are going to show up, you're sort of more or less in control of that, you actually have no control of how many show up, right? And that actually goes to a larger point. It might be a boy, it might be a girl, it might be one of each. You don't know. It might be a genius, or it might be a profoundly disabled child. You don't know. It might be the sweetest kid you've ever met, or it might be a kid who you're working with on their temper from the time they're 13 months old until they leave your house. That's a problem for them, right? You don't know what you're signing up for. It might be you in miniature. It might be your husband or your wife in miniature. And everything you love about your husband or wife, you're going to love in that kid. And everything that drives you crazy about your husband or wife is going to drive you crazy in that kid. And you don't get to pick. But here's the thing about marriage in general and children in particular, right? Marriage is a sacrament. That means it's supposed to make you holy. The people you have to share a house with are the normal way that God makes us more and more into the people we're called to be. And in fact, into the people we want to be. The problems that you marry, and you know already what some of those are. You are going to marry a person with problems, and you are going to have to live with that person and their problems for some time, right? Those problems are what God is going to use, if you will let him, into the person he wants you to be. And when you have a child who's got problems, or when you have twins and you don't sleep for 18 months or however long it was, I lost count, God is going to use that to make you holy if you leave open the possibility that what he is giving you is a gift and not just a burden, right? And that attitude of children as a burden or an accident or a commodity impairs our ability to love them as well as we might, and to even see that the challenges that they bring into our marriage and into our lives are a good thing that make us more and more into who God wants us to be.